Nathan Cole walked into Boyd Garfield's office on a Wednesday afternoon and set a copy of the invoice on the desk. $14,200. Itemized. 37 days outstanding. Boyd didn't look at it. He leaned back and said the company had no record of a signed work order, no obligation recognized, and this conversation was over. Nathan didn't move. Boyd stood up, walked around the desk, and opened the office door. Nathan picked up the invoice, folded it once, and put it back in his pocket. He walked out. In the hallway, a woman stood with a clipboard and a federal ID badge clipped to her collar, waiting to be shown into the operations office next door. She glanced at Nathan as he passed. He didn't look back. The helicopter Boyd refused to pay for sat on the ramp 40 feet away. No flight plan had been filed for it in over 2 weeks. Nobody was flying it. What happens when the only man who knows what's actually wrong with that helicopter is also the man they refuse to pay? Stay with this one. Nathan had leased Bay 4 at Bozeman Yellowstone International's General Aviation Terminal for 3 years. Steel tool cabinet bolted to the east wall, a hydraulic lift that worked if you knew which valve to ease first, 2 shop lights on extension cords with permanent kinks from being repositioned too many times. Against the south wall, a folding table where his son Caleb spread his homework most afternoons while Nathan worked. The Garfield job had come in 8 weeks earlier through a parts broker named Pete Aldrich, who passed Boyd's number to Nathan and said Boyd needed a Bell 206 rebuilt fast. The helicopter, tail number November 4418 Golf, was in rough shape. A cracked tailboom. A main rotor head run 40 hours past its overhaul interval. Worn pitch links. A tail rotor drive shaft with a bearing that had been grinding long enough to score the housing. Nathan had asked for a written work scope before he started. Boyd said he'd send one. He never did. Nathan started anyway. Boyd's operations manager, a man named Denny Holt, logged Nathan into the satellite hangar's access record and handed him the maintenance logbooks. 6 weeks of work followed. Tailboom splice, rotor head teardown, and full rebuild. New pitch links. Complete tail rotor drive system replacement. A systems run-up at the end that took most of a Friday afternoon before the numbers settled. He logged every hour, every part number, every torque value. That was the discipline from his years in Wichita, where he'd been a lead airframe engineer at a Sikorsky service center for 11 years before a corporate merger eliminated the division and put 200 people out in the same week. You logged everything. The logbook was the record of what you'd actually done. When he finished, he handed Denny a typed invoice for $14,200. He did not sign the return to service release. Without that signature, November 4418 Golf could not legally fly. The invoice and the signature were the same piece of leverage, and Nathan intended to hold both until he was paid. 3 days later, Boyd's assistant called and said the amount was not what they had agreed to. Nathan asked what number they had agreed to. The assistant said she wasn't authorized to discuss that. Nathan waited. Boyd's office sent 2 more calls over the following week, then went quiet. What Nathan didn't know yet was that Boyd had found a solution. A certificated mechanic from Billings named Wes Pruitt came to the satellite hangar, spent 1 day on site, and signed the return to service documentation on work he had not performed. On paper, November 4418 Golf was cleared for service. What Boyd hadn't accounted for was Roy Tanner. Roy had been flying for Garfield Air for 22 years, charters, AG runs, utility work across 3 counties. He knew every aircraft in Boyd's fleet by feel. 2 days before Nathan walked into Boyd's office, Roy taxied November 4418 Golf to the ramp, ran it up to flight idle, put his feet on the pedals, and listened. For minutes. Then he shut it down and walked back inside. He told Denny he wasn't taking it up. Denny asked why. Roy said it didn't feel right. He didn't file a write-up. He just didn't fly it. That evening he wrote 4 lines in his personal pilot logbook. The date, the tail number, his assessment, and exactly what Denny said when Roy asked who had actually done the maintenance. Caleb got back from school that afternoon and found his father at the workbench, still in the jacket he'd worn to Boyd's office. Caleb set his backpack by the folding table and spread out his homework without saying anything. Nathan made 2 sandwiches and set one on the corner of the table without a word. Caleb picked it up and kept reading. Laura Keene's assignment that Wednesday had been a routine ops certificate renewal inspection for Garfield Air Services. The kind of review she completed twice a week. Fleet list, training records, airworthiness directives compliance, maintenance program documentation. Half a day, standard procedure. These reviews almost never turned up anything that the paperwork hadn't already told her. She had been standing in the hallway outside the operations office, waiting on Denny Holt to retrieve the maintenance binders from the back room, when the man in the work jacket came through the side door and walked past her toward the exit. She registered him the way she registered most people on an operator's site. Posture, pace, whether anything about him was inconsistent with the environment. Nothing was. She moved on. The ops review took 2 hours. Fleet list current. Training records in order. AD compliance current across all registered aircraft. Boyd's paperwork was clean, the way it always was. That was the thing she'd noticed over the years about operators who kept their files immaculate. It sometimes meant they knew exactly which details to keep out of the official record. On her way back to her truck, Laura walked the ramp. 8 years as an inspector had made the habit automatic enough that she did it without deciding to. She was halfway across when she noticed November 4418 Golf against the south wall of the satellite hangar. Fresh paint on the tail boom splice. The particular feathered edge where new paint meets old that only appears when structural repair work has been done recently. Structural repair work on a rotorcraft required a return to service entry in the airframe logbook. She went back inside and pulled the logbook from the hangar office shelf. The entry was there, dated 18 days ago, signed by ANP certificate number 342-8801. She ran the number from her truck. Wesley Pruitt. Billings address. Active certificate, 11 years, no violations, no incidents. She checked the satellite hangar access log. A paper binder on a hook by Denny's desk, the kind of low-tech record-keeping that small satellite operations still ran on. Pruitt's name appeared once. The same day as the return to service signature. Timestamp in, 8:47 in the morning. Timestamp out, 5:52 in the evening. 9 hours total. Above Pruitt's single entry, another name ran across 31 consecutive working days. In before 7 most mornings, out after 5 most evenings. N. Cole. ANP certificate 219-4407. Laura sat in her truck and did the math. A Bell 206 rotor head overhaul, teardown, inspection, rebuild, documentation was a minimum of 8 hours of focused work for an experienced mechanic who already understood the aircraft. The tailboom splice was additional time. The pitch links, the drive shaft work, a full systems run-up, all of it additional. The scope of work logged across 31 days of access records could not have been credibly inspected in 9 hours. Not with any rigor that would hold up to scrutiny. She opened a new enforcement case file on her laptop and typed the incident summary in flat, factual language. Then she cross-referenced Nathan's certificate number against the registered business address in the database. Bay 4, Bozeman Yellowstone International. She pulled back onto the road and drove. She recognized him the moment he turned around from the workbench. The man from the hallway. He was still in the same jacket. She introduced herself. Laura Keene, FAA FSDO, Bozeman. She showed her credentials and gave him a moment to read them. Nathan looked at the badge, then at her. He waited. She asked whether he had performed maintenance on November 4418 Golf at the Garfield satellite hangar over the past 6 weeks. He said yes. She asked whether he had signed the return to service documentation. He said no. She asked why not. Nathan reached to the shelf above his workbench and set a manila folder on the bench between them. Invoice, parts receipts, torque logs. The work scope he'd written out himself the first week of the job when it became clear Boyd was never going to send one. Laura opened the folder and worked through it page by page. She didn't rush. The parts receipts cross-referenced against the log entries in the correct sequence. The torque values recorded in Nathan's close, even handwriting. Every fastener noted with its specified value and the actual measured value he'd observed. The work scope laid out in the order a working mechanic would actually follow the job, not the order someone would write it after the fact. 8 minutes. Nathan didn't speak. He stood with his back against the bench and his arms at his sides, and let her read. She looked up and asked if he had the satellite hangar access log entries for his visits. He said those were Garfield's records, not his. She told him she already had them. Nathan went still. Not quite relief, something quieter than that. The particular stillness of someone who has been carrying something alone long enough that he'd stopped expecting anyone else to see it. She asked him to walk her through the work scope against his log entries, start to finish. They stood at the workbench for 40 minutes. Nathan took her through every line item without hurrying. She asked questions that told him she understood the difference between a mechanic who had documented work and a mechanic who had documented what they wished they'd done. She asked about the bearing scoring on the drive shaft housing and whether he'd caught it on the initial inspection or during teardown. She asked which pitch link assemblies had been replaced versus inspected and retained. She asked about the run-up parameters he'd used to sign off the rigging. She didn't tell him what she was going to do with the information. When she was done, she asked if she could take a copy of the folder. Nathan pulled a second copy from the same shelf. He'd made 2 the week Boyd's office stopped returning calls. He handed it to her. She thanked him. She walked out. Nathan stood at the bench after her truck pulled away. He didn't pick up the wrench. Boyd Garfield found out about the FSDO visit within 24 hours. A flight school instructor who kept the Cessna at the satellite hangar had seen Laura's government truck on the ramp and mentioned it to Denny. Denny called Boyd. Boyd's first call was to a county commissioner named Stuart Haas. They'd known each other since 2009, when Stuart had helped Boyd manage a noise complaint that could have cost him his FBO lease. A quiet word placed in the right room. A review timeline that extended long enough for Boyd's attorneys to work. Stuart knew how pressure was applied and where it could reach. Stuart told him straight out he couldn't do anything about the FAA. Federal jurisdiction, wrong lever entirely. Boyd already knew that. He wasn't calling about the FAA. He asked Stuart to flag Nathan Cole's hangar lease renewal with the Airport Authority Board. Bayfor was up for renewal in 11 days. Boyd wanted an administrative review placed on the file before it processed. Stuart said he would look into it. Boyd's second call was to Pruitt. He told him to make sure his paperwork was solid. Pruitt said it was. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. After Boyd hung up, Pruitt sat at his kitchen table in Billings and didn't move for a while. His coffee went cold next to his hand. Nathan's lease renewal notice arrived in his email that afternoon. Flagged for administrative review, a category that didn't appear anywhere in the standard renewal process he'd been through 3 times without incident. He forwarded it to Greg Walsh, a general practice attorney in Bozeman he'd worked with 2 years earlier on a different contract dispute. Walsh called back within an hour. He said it had the shape of pressure rather than actual legal cause. He said to document everything, attend any scheduled hearing, and bring every record Nathan had. Nathan printed the email and added it to the folder. He picked Caleb up from school that afternoon, and they stopped at a diner on the way back. A place with good pie that Caleb had been going to since he was small. Caleb ordered cherry. Nathan ordered coffee. The booth was narrow and the windows were fogged at the corners, and the pie came out fast and hot. Caleb ate most of it while Nathan drank the coffee and watched the street outside. Neither of them said much. It was one of those afternoons where neither of them needed to. Laura's records request came back from the regional office with Pruitt's full certificate history. 11 years. Agricultural and charter endorsements. No violations, no enforcement actions, no pattern of anything that would suggest habitual shortcuts or disregard for the work, which made it specific in a way that mattered. Pruitt hadn't done this before. He'd made one particular decision for one particular operator, and the question wasn't whether it had happened. The access log and the math had answered that, but what it had cost him to make it. She requested a voluntary interview. Pruitt agreed to come in. He drove from Billings to Bozeman on a Tuesday morning and sat across a conference table from Laura at the FSDO office. He was in his mid-50s, composed in the way that experienced tradespeople often are, careful with language, deliberate about what he confirmed and what he left open-ended. He answered every question. His answers were competent and general, the kind of technical walkthrough a certificated mechanic could give for any Bell 206 of that generation without having laid a hand on the specific airframe. He described the control systems correctly. He described the drive-train layout correctly. Everything he said was accurate, and none of it was specific. Laura set Nathan's torque log on the table between them. 12 pages, handwritten. Every fastener on the rotor head documented with the part number, the manual specified torque value, and the actual measured value Nathan had recorded at the time of installation. She asked Pruitt which values had been out of tolerance when he inspected the aircraft. Pruitt looked at the log. He said none of them. Laura asked how he would know, given that a thorough inspection of a rotor head overhaul was a minimum of 4 hours of focused work on its own, and his single day on site had also included a logbook review, a walk-around, an engine run-up, and the completion of all return-to-service documentation. The hours didn't add up. There was no version of the timeline where all of it fit into 9 hours with any rigor. Pruitt didn't answer. Laura closed the torque log and told him the interview was complete. She told him he should retain a lawyer before any further contact from the FSDO. She said it the way she said everything, flat, procedural, without additional weight. But Pruitt understood what it meant. He straightened his jacket when he stood up, the small involuntary adjustment of a man who has just felt the ground shift under him. After he left, Laura drove to the satellite hangar and walked around November 4418 Golf with a flashlight, not touching anything, just looking. Nathan's tailboom splice was clean. The rivet pattern matched the maintenance manual specification. The paint was feathered correctly along both edges of the repair. She crouched and looked at the underside of the tailboom where the crack had originated. The repair extended past the visible damage on both sides, the kind of margin you only take when you found the parent material and confirmed its sound. She had been doing this job for 8 years. She knew the difference between work that had been done right and work that had been signed right. That evening, she called the number listed as a signed PIC on November 4418 Golf's flight roster. Roy Tanner. She asked if he would be willing to come in and speak with her about the aircraft's recent flight history, specifically, the absence of any logged flights since the return to service date. Roy said Thursday morning worked for him. That same evening, Nathan got a second email from the airport authority. The administrative review would require a board hearing before the lease could be renewed. The hearing was in 9 days. He forwarded it to Walsh. Walsh told him to show up and bring everything he had. Nathan drove to the satellite hangar that night. He still had the access code from the job. Denny had never asked for it back. He went in, photographed November 4418 Golf from every angle, documented the splice, photographed the page in the maintenance logbook where Pruitt's entry appeared. He didn't touch the aircraft. He drove back to Bay 4 and sat at the workbench for a while in the dark with his phone open, the photographs loading one at a time. Re-engagement beat. Boyd Garfield had spent the better part of 30 years building an operation on the assumption that the people below him needed him more than he needed them. He had not considered what happened when that equation reversed itself. Roy Tanner came into the FSDO on Thursday morning in work boots and a plain jacket, and he sat down across the table from Laura with the settled manner of a man who had already decided what he was going to say before he parked his truck. Laura asked him to describe what had happened the morning he ran up November 4418 Golf and brought it back in without logging a departure. Roy said the pedal response was off. Tail rotor on left pedal input had a lag that wasn't there before the aircraft went in for maintenance. Not a large lag, not the kind that would have tripped a pre-flight check. But it was there under his feet, and he'd sat with it for 4 minutes at flight idle and decided he wasn't going to take it off the ground until someone who knew what they were looking at had verified the tail rotor rigging was correct. Laura asked if he had filed a formal maintenance write-up. Roy said he'd told Denny verbally. She asked if he'd documented it anywhere else. Roy reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed his personal pilot logbook on the table. He opened it to the entry dated the morning of the aborted run-up. For sentences in his own handwriting, in the same pen he'd used for every entry in the logbook going back more than 12 years. The date, the tail number, his assessment of the pedal response and the basis for his go/no-go decision. And then one additional sentence, what Denny Holt had said when Roy asked him, directly, who had performed the actual maintenance on that aircraft before the return to service entry was signed. Denny's answer, as Roy had written it down that same evening. The guy who fixed it won't sign off because of a money thing, so Boyd got someone else to handle the paperwork. Laura read the entry twice. She looked at the surrounding pages, the same pen, the same format, the same unhurried handwriting Roy had used consistently across years of entries. The entry was dated, time-stamped against the flight roster by the tail number, and written in the tone of a man recording a professional decision rather than building a case. Roy closed the logbook and returned it to his jacket pocket. He said he would provide a sworn statement if the FSDO needed one. He said it without emphasis, a statement of availability rather than an act of courage, though it was both. Laura asked him why he was willing. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had been climbing into Boyd Garfield's aircraft for 22 years. He'd never once sat down in the left seat and wondered whether what he was sitting in was actually airworthy. He didn't want to start now. He said he had a family. He said those two things as though they were connected, which they were. After Roy left, Laura sat at the conference table with her hands flat on the surface for a long moment. Then she issued the grounding notice on November 4418 Golf. Airworthiness undetermined. Return to service documentation under enforcement review. She also flagged Boyd's operator file for a fleet-wide maintenance records audit. Standard procedure once an enforcement action was active against a certificated operator. All of it by the book, all of it in the flat procedural language the job required. Boyd received the grounding notice by the end of business that day. His aviation attorney in Billings answered on the second ring. The attorney asked one question. Did the physical work performed on November 4418 Golf exist in documentable form anywhere outside of Pruitt's signature? Boyd said Pruitt had signed it. The attorney explained that Pruitt's signature was now the subject of an active enforcement action. If the FAA determined it was fraudulent, the aircraft had no valid return to service record. The grounding would be indefinite. And with the fleet audit open, every aircraft in Boyd's operation was under review that Boyd could not close from the inside. The attorney asked if the mechanic who had actually done the work had kept records. Boyd didn't answer right away. Boyd's attorney reached out to Greg Walsh the following morning. Professionally worded, carefully constructed, would Nathan Cole be willing to provide his maintenance documentation to support resolution of the airworthiness dispute? Walsh called Nathan and read the message to him word for word. Nathan asked Walsh what he thought it meant. Walsh said it meant Boyd needed Nathan's records more than Nathan needed Boyd's money right now. He said it the way a man says something that should be obvious but is still worth saying out loud. Nathan thought about that for a moment. He was at the workbench when the call came in, and he stayed where he was while Walsh talked, one hand resting on the edge of the bench. Then he told Walsh to tell them payment in full had to clear before any documentation was discussed. Not simultaneously. Before. Walsh said he'd pass it along. Boyd's attorney got the response within the hour. That afternoon, the same attorney quietly called Stuart Haas and told him the administrative review flag on Bay 4 needed to disappear. The board hearing was 4 days out and Boyd could not afford to have Nathan standing in front of an airport authority panel with a federal enforcement action open against Boyd's operation. Stuart made a call. By the following morning, the hearing notification had been pulled from the airport authority's agenda. No explanation given, no reschedule notice, no contact from the board. Nathan found out when Walsh called him that afternoon. Walsh read him the cancellation notice and told him not to spend time on questions that didn't have useful answers. Nathan said okay. He printed the notice and added it to the binder, which was thick enough by then that he'd moved the whole thing to a 2-inch ring binder he'd found on the shelf above his workbench. Laura came to Bay for that same afternoon. She said it wasn't an official visit. She wanted him to know the grounding notice had been issued and the fleet audit was open. She said it standing just inside the bay door, not moving further in, as though she'd drawn a line at the threshold between what was professional and what wasn't. She told him Roy Tanner had come in and provided a statement. Nathan set down the fitting he'd been holding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if Roy was going to have a problem because of it. Laura said Roy was a pilot in command exercising his authority over the airworthiness of his own aircraft. Under the regulations he was protected, and she said it in a way that meant she'd already checked. Nathan nodded once. He didn't say anything else about Roy. A few minutes later, Caleb came in from the parking lot with his backpack over one shoulder. He noticed Laura, slowed slightly, then kept walking to the folding table. Nathan introduced them. First names only. Caleb said hey. He dropped his backpack on the table, pulled out a book, and settled into the chair. He didn't make anything of the introduction, just opened to his page and started reading. Laura looked at the folding table for a moment, then back at Nathan. She left a few minutes after that. Nathan stood at the open bay door and watched her truck back out of the lot and turn onto the access road. He stayed there a second after she was gone, the evening air coming in flat and cool off the ramp. Then he turned back to the bench. Re-engagement beat. Boyd Garfield had built his leverage on the assumption that he controlled what Nathan needed. He had not considered that he'd had it backwards the whole time. The formal settlement offer came through Walsh 6 days later. Full invoice amount plus 30 days of calculated interest. Payment to be wired within 5 business days of Nathan's signature. In exchange, Nathan would deliver his complete maintenance documentation and a written statement confirming the physical work had been performed correctly and in accordance with the applicable maintenance manual specifications. The offer was structured to say nothing about cause. No admission, no acknowledgement of Pruitt's signature, no mention of the enforcement action, no language that connected the payment to any wrongdoing on Boyd's part. It was drafted to look like a routine settlement of a billing dispute between two parties who had reached an agreement. Walsh called Nathan and read it to him in full, then waited. Nathan asked if Boyd was admitting the documentation was fraudulent. Walsh said the offer was silent on that. It was going to stay silent on that. Nathan thought about it for a moment. He considered what it would mean to push, to demand language, to make Boyd say it in writing. He thought about what that would cost in time, in legal fees, in hearings, in months of his lease sitting under someone's thumb. Then he said he wanted the invoice paid. He didn't need Boyd to say anything else out loud. He signed the acceptance that afternoon and faxed it to Walsh's office. The wire transfer arrived on the 4th business day. $14,200 plus $412 in interest. Nathan's phone buzzed on the workbench while he was replacing a magneto on a Cessna that belonged to a flight school across the field. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, picked up the phone, and read the bank notification twice. He stood there for a moment in the middle of the bay with the phone in his hand. Outside the open door, the ramp was doing what it always did. A twin taxiing to the fuel pump, a ground crew moving cones, the ordinary business of an airport going about its afternoon. Nathan set the phone face down on the bench and went back to the magneto. That evening he called Walsh and thanked him. Then he called back 30 seconds later and asked what he owed. Walsh quoted $600 flat, the same number he'd given at the start of the whole thing, before either of them knew how far it would go. Nathan wired it before he went to bed. The next morning, he drove to the FSDO with his full documentation package. Every log page, every parts receipt, every torque sheet, the work scope, the run-up data, organized in a second binder in the same order he'd used when he walked Laura through it at his workbench 3 weeks earlier. Laura was in the building when he arrived. The receptionist called back, and she came out to the front desk. Nathan set the binder on the counter between them. Laura said she'd make sure it was filed correctly. Nathan said okay. He stood there a moment longer than the handoff required. She didn't move to go back inside. Then he said he appreciated her coming to the bay that first afternoon. She said that was the job. He nodded once. He left. The enforcement case ran its process over the following weeks. Pruitt's certificate was suspended pending a formal hearing. 18 months, reinstated after with conditions attached. Boyd's operator's certificate remained active, but the fleet audit turned up 2 additional maintenance entries with documentation gaps significant enough to require corrective action. The enhanced oversight designation stayed on Boyd's file for 18 months. Boyd's aviation attorney filed a written response contesting the scope of the audit on procedural grounds. The FSDO reviewed it and declined to narrow the scope. 2 of Boyd's charter clients decided the timeline for clearing the review was longer than they were willing to wait. They found other operators. Wes Pruitt did not contest his suspension. His attorney sent a 1-page response acknowledging the findings and accepting the terms. Pruitt's name dropped out of the case file after that. He was not someone Nathan thought about much. He'd made a decision, and he'd live with what it cost him. That was between Pruitt and his own logbook. Roy Tanner put in his notice at Garfield Air about 6 weeks after the grounding notice. He didn't announce it or explain it. He picked up a contract with a different operator out of Billings, more flight hours, better routes, newer equipment. On his last day, he cleaned out his locker, shook a few hands, and drove north. He didn't make a thing of leaving, which was the same way he'd handled everything else. Nathan heard about it from Pete Aldridge, the parts broker who'd originally connected him with the Garfield job. Pete said Roy had landed somewhere better. Nathan said that was good to hear. He didn't say anything else about it. Nathan's lease renewed without incident. The notice came through on a Tuesday morning. No flags, no board hearing, no administrative review, just a standard renewal at the same rate. He filed the paperwork, added it to the binder out of habit, and went back to the Cessna he had up on the lift. Bayford looked the same as it always had. The tool cabinet, the lift, the shop lights at the same angles he'd put them in 3 years ago. One afternoon, Caleb came in from school and, instead of going straight to the folding table, walked over to the workbench where Nathan was calibrating a torque wrench. He stood next to Nathan and watched without saying anything for a full minute. Then he asked if he could see how it worked. Nathan handed it to him and showed him the scale along the handle. He explained the mechanism, the way the internal spring loaded against the fastener until the applied torque hit the set value and the head released. He let Caleb feel the tension build before the break point. Caleb asked how you knew when something was tight enough if you couldn't see the numbers. Nathan said you learned to feel it. You did it enough times, and eventually your hands knew before the tool did. Caleb positioned the wrench on a bench bolt, applied pressure slowly, and felt the click when it released. He held it there a moment, checking. Then he looked up. Nathan had already turned back to the bench and was sorting through a tray of fittings. But there was something in the way he moved, unhurried, certain, no wasted motion, that answered the question Caleb hadn't quite put into words. 6 weeks after the settlement, Laura came to Bay 4 after her shift ended. She parked in the same spot she'd used the first time, the gravel lot off the access road, and walked in through the open bay door without knocking. Nathan was at the bench with his back to her. He heard her boots on the concrete and turned around. She said she wanted to let him know the Pruitt hearing had concluded, 18-month suspension, certificate to be reinstated with conditions on the back end. Nathan thanked her. She said she also wanted him to know the fleet audit on Garfield's operation had closed. The 2 additional documentation gaps had been corrected under the oversight agreement. Boyd's certificate was intact. Nathan nodded. He didn't have anything to say about Boyd Garfield, and it showed. She asked if the work had been steady. He said it had. 2 annuals the week before, back to back. A prop strike inspection that had been waiting on a parts delay finally came through. He had an AG helicopter coming in from Livingston the following week that would probably take the better part of 3 days. She looked around the bay. The bench, the lift, the tool cabinet, the shop lights hanging at the same angles they'd been at since he moved in. The folding table against the south wall with Caleb's backpack dropped against one leg and a library book sitting on top of his math worksheet. She asked how long he'd been running the bay on his own. He said 3 years since he signed the lease. Longer than that since Wichita. She asked what had happened in Wichita. He said a corporate merger. The division that ran the service center got folded into a larger maintenance group headquartered in Dallas. 200 people out the same week. He'd been there 11 years. She said that was a long time to have something end. He said he hadn't thought of it that way at the time. He'd found a bay and signed a lease and started working. That was about as much of a plan as he'd had. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, not searching. The kind that settles between 2 people who are both at ease in the same space. She asked if he ever missed it. The scale of it, the engineering side. Nathan considered it the way he considered things, without rushing toward an answer. He said he missed the aircraft. He didn't miss the org chart. She laughed. Short and quiet, more breath than sound. The first thing either of them had said that had nothing to do with work or regulations or someone else's problem. Caleb had his head down over the worksheet on the folding table. His pencil moved, stopped, moved again. He was working something out. Laura watched him for a moment. Then she looked back at Nathan. Nathan was already looking at her. She said she should probably head out. He said there was a coffee machine on the shelf by the tool cabinet. He said it wasn't a good one. The hot plate ran too hot, and the timer had stopped working 2 years ago, so you had to remember to switch it off yourself. But there was coffee in it. Laura looked at the machine. A small drip unit with a permanent ring stain on the warming plate, the kind of appliance that had been in the same spot long enough to stop being noticed. She looked at the folding table. Caleb hadn't looked up. She said sure. She stepped back inside. Nathan took 2 mugs off the shelf and filled them. He handed her one without asking how she took it. She didn't ask for anything different. They stood at the workbench with the bay door still open to the evening. The light had gone low and flat the way it did in Bozeman in early fall, coming in at a long angle across the concrete floor. Outside, the ramp was quiet. Somewhere on the far side of the field a helicopter lifted off, smooth, clean, level from the moment the skids left the ground, and climbed steadily into the open air above the valley, growing smaller against the pale sky, and then smaller than that, until it was just a moving point, and then nothing. Neither of them said anything about it. They stood there and watched it go.